issue this year. So, King, I pose to you the question, is tackling going to be an issue for Stanford in 2020?
College football this year, you've seen tackling be a massive issue. And I mean, you're seeing overs hitting all over the place. You're seeing some ridiculous scores. Memphis UCF was 50-49. Ole Miss Alabama was 63-48. These are some crazy games. And I think Stanford is going to be hurt by this more than most because, first of all, they're having less time to tackle. They just started tackling this past week. I mean, we are less than 3 weeks out from game day, which, whoo, go Card. But at the same time, they're really shortening the timeline. And tackling was an issue for the Cardinal last year. Think about how much trouble Stanford has had in recent years getting dual-threat QBs to the ground. The Cardinal defensive line made Ian Book look like Lamar Jackson. Not so much throwing the ball, but definitely running the ball. I mean, he was able to escape numerous times. I think of Jake Browning, another not very athletic guy who was able to frequently escape the pocket because Stanford's pass rushers couldn't get into the ground. And if you think about Stanford's biggest issues defensively in big games in recent years, it has been looking very unathletic compared to their opponents. And that comes through in tackling. If you look at the UCF game, if you look at the USC game last year, if you look at the Notre Dame games recently, and it's to a certain extent the Oregon and Washington games, there are better athletes on the other side, and Stanford's secondary and linebackers are struggling to get guys on the ground. And I see that continuing. Well, I'll talk about it later. There's some guys I think could kind of fill that void. But tackling was an issue last year. It's going to be a bigger issue this year. And I think the biggest concern for me when we talked about recruiting recently is that Stanford looks progressively less and less athletic compared to their peers. And that is something that they've got to remedy. They've got to get that elite talent on the back end, and particularly in the front seven.
I mean, you just listed off a whole lot of big games. What about the big game last year when Chase Garbers beat them on the ground? That's one to me. It's just like missed tackling. That's really what it comes down to. And the one thing that gives me hope is that their Oregon game last year was actually one of their better graded tackling games. PFF had the defensive line's run defense at an 80.8 and tackling at 83.7. One of the better performances of that group, actually. But other than that, has to be very worrisome. And David Shaw talked this past week about like 3 levels of tackling, he called it. One was like basically a high school level where you're pretty inconsistent. You're not going to tackle consistently. The other is professional level, where you could maybe take 9 months off because of COVID, not tackle anyone, come right out, first day of practice, hit everyone hard, you're secure. And then there's where most of Stanford players are and where most collegiate players are, which is they know it, they can tell you exactly what needs to be done, how to square up, but they can't always execute. And that's where I think a lot of Stanford players are right now. What has me worried and also hopeful is that they had all of those Zoom meetings. They've all had all of those classroom sessions to say, this is how we tackle. Now it's how well can they translate that onto the field. It's not dummies anymore. They're going against real guys real soon, and we're going to find out. I don't know what the answer is going to look like. We'll talk about that later, that no one really has seen what they look like. But that is kind of where we're at right now, where it's up in the air. It's what were these guys doing in the offseason? Can they put what they learned in the classroom into practice? Can they take what they learned in lecture into the lab?
Daniel, I hate to tell you, watching Zoom meetings does not help you tackle a man on the football field. Those two things are worlds apart, I got to say. I was just on a webinar with Stanford women's volleyball head coach Kevin Hambley. And I asked him, is there any advantage to the virtual format? Is there anything that you've liked that you want to take forward? He's like, nothing. Face-to-face interaction is the key. And even more so, actually participating in the sport you're going to play is the key. So yes, Zoom meetings allow these teams to build chemistry, and I think that's the most important thing that you could do in that offseason. I think Stanford football does have good chemistry. I think they are a brotherhood. They believe that they're going to come out and have a great season. But in terms of execution, it's just like you said. You can know exactly what to do to tackle any player, be from Derrick Henry to a high school freshman. But it's not the same as going out there and doing it. And I think it's particularly hard when you get in that full speed situation and all of a sudden you've got to think about, all right, what defense are we in? What is the offense doing? What is this formation telling me? And then somebody is running at you full speed with a blocker and you got to get him to the ground. I think that has been a major concern. And I think it really highlights the concern that I've seen otherwise with Stanford's pass rush, that frankly, they're not getting guys to the ground frequently enough. And that is where Stanford's defense, I think, will either be, that's where it will live and die. Because I think the secondary, there's questions, but we know it'll hold up okay. Dwayne Akina has earned that respect. Linebackers, I'm worried, but I think Curtis Robinson's going to anchor that group. But the defensive line, I just don't know what to expect. Thomas Booker is a very talented player. Dalen Wade-Perry is a talented player. Gabe Reed's shown a lot. Tomas Schaffer is a project, but I think potentially a productive project. And there's other guys there that should flash, like Andres Fox. But when I look at it, I don't see anybody who's been there before, who's proven that they're going to get in the backfield and put a quarterback on his butt. And I think that has to do with tackling. It also has to do with talent and being able to beat college-level offensive linemen. And I think that, like I said, that is where Stanford's defense is going to make or break its season in 2020.
Yeah, the one thing I want to touch on from that is you mentioned that all of those other things that go on, you're asking yourself what defense we are in before you tackle. I think Stanford has made a concerted effort to pare that down. They've made simpler defenses. They've gone back. They looked at film. They figured out what worked. They threw out what didn't. So I think they have talked about paring down that defense. Kendall Williamson talked about it. They said David Shaw talked about it. Lance Anderson's talked about it. We're going to make it smaller. We're going to make sure everyone knows what's going on. And we're going to play fast. So I do think that will help. But I'm totally with you. I think Thomas Booker you have to look to on the defensive line. And then after that, questions. And we're really going to find out what a lot of guys are made of. In addition to Curtis Robinson, I'm really excited for Ricky Miezon and Jacob Mangum-Farrar. Two guys who are both really hard hitters, have just coming back from injury. And then also Kendall Williamson, who Simi Fehoko last week talked about as the hardest hitter and the most sure hitter in terms of tackling. So all of those guys, I think, are going to really make or break the season, as you're talking about. But as you're saying, Stanford not in a good position in a year when every team is in a bad position with tackling, and really going to be worried about what we're going to see week one and beyond that. Because if Stanford is once again facing tackling as an issue, as they had last year and the year before that, in for a very tough season. And sadly, my 5-1 prediction, I don't think is going to hold up.
Listen, let's throw some positivity because we're just really throwing some fuel on the negativity fire, which we don't need in 2020. But I do think there is, just like you said, a lot of potential talent on this defense. And Stanford, as we know, is a disciplined team, a well-coached defensive team. Lance Anderson has been there for a long time. He has been running this defense extremely well. We talk about his halftime adjustments. We talk about his ability to just completely fool quarterbacks, particularly in the second half of games. But I think he's also a great teacher of fundamentals. Dwayne Akina is a great teacher of fundamentals. The rest of this defensive coaching staff, they are able to get guys coached up to do as best as their talent can net them. And I think, we don't have a Paulson Adebo this year. You don't have a Solomon Thomas or even a Harrison Phillips, but you have some talented guys who maybe can grow into that. And I think, to me, it's all about, can you get a difference maker at each level of defense? And if I'm looking at a difference maker on the defensive line, I'm looking at Thomas Booker. I think he has that potential if he can play up to, particularly just what he looks like. I mean, that man is scary and absolutely jacked. And I think a guy who has the body to be an NFL talent and the mind as well, a very smart football player. And then at the linebacker position, Curtis Robinson is the established guy, but can one of those guys you mentioned, Ricky Miezon or Jacob Magnum-Farrar, turn into a star at linebacker, a sideline-to-sideline guy? And in the back end, can you get a guy like, I don't know, Caillou Blue Kelly, Jonathan McGill, or just like you mentioned, Kendall Williamson, to become an elite, don't throw at that guy kind of secondary player? Then you're looking at a much better situation for the Stanford defense.
With you all along there, King, and it's just mind-boggling, right? That there's so much variability from what Stanford was as a defense to where they are now. And it's worrying, and I get to what you're talking about a few weeks ago with recruiting, where they're not recruiting the same athletic guys, and I think that's showing. But to another point that I made, that the coaching staff is usually able to make the most of it, that Stanford can under-recruit at times, but then have such good development and have people who are so able to learn because they are Stanford student athletes, that they're able to pick up on all of these things. And however much Zoom sessions don't help, eventually when they're seeing the field, even if it's at Woodside High School, basically I'm saying I hope they don't play like high school players when they step out on a college field this year. So with all of that, we're having to do all of this